First, I would like to thank Sherry Steiner and CTSB for having me here. The story of Sue Moody that I'm about to tell you is more relevant than ever, as war, bombs, and starvation unfortunately rages in far corners of our world. Sue Moody's story is ever more relevant. My name is Gail Gelburd, and I am a writer, artist, and art historian. I came across Sue Moody's story during the pandemic. Remember that? A friend convinced me to join the Otis Historic Commission, and I met up with a group of terrific people who were sorting through boxes of old letters, journals, and manuscripts that had been donated by her neighbor, Marley Coffey, after she passed away. They were papers like this, just all over the place. She had found these boxes in a now decaying and battered house in rural Otis, Mass, on a main road. These crumbling boxes sat amongst cobwebs, fallen beams, and mouse droppings. Lots of those. Some pages were fading, some were weathered, some were yellowing and had aging brown spots. Some were legible, some were not. The letters were from friends, colleagues, lovers, family. They tell the story of Sue Moody, a journalist, author, and poet. She even wrote poetry for the Monterey paper every month. Some of the people that she was in contact with were famous, some were not. Some, like the unsinkable Molly Brown, was a good friend of her. She wrote almost every day for decades, as if someone one day would read them and know that she did exist. Well, her story will now keep her alive. Each page once held a secret, a relationship, or a story. After years of going through these boxes, reading her manuscripts, and published articles, I have written a historic fictional narrative using her voice and words as much as possible. I filled in where needed to provide context for the devastating and inspiring things that covered her life. Much of her writings or journal notations question her role as a writer versus a wife and mother. She wrote of needing to be saved for the dragons of society. Hence the title of my book is Slaying the Dragon, The Liberation of Sue Moody. She cried out that she never realized how much she needed to be rescued. She asked if a knight in shining armor would be there to save her. Will her knight be on a glistening white horse with a jeweled harness and glistening bells, scoop her up and carry her away? How will she know when she has found him? Where was Sue Moody's savior when she struggled alone with a child in France as the Nazis took control? Her story is about survival, bombings, food, and starvation, and the plight of a woman in the early 20th century. My historic narrative starts with Sue Moody's assignment as a food column writer, alone in Paris with her child, as Nazi German tanks rolled down the boulevard beneath her window. All she could hear was guttural commands, the teals and wailings of her son and neighbors, and screeching bombs. The food editor was now to become the starvation journalist. Sue Moody would have to reevaluate her life choices and find ways to endure through war, famine, fear, malnourishment, abandonment, sickness, and despair. The book goes back and forth between trying to find a way to survive in war-torn France and the pivotal moments in her life that defined who she was as a woman, as a writer, and how she survived. I'd like to start by reading you some of the first chapter of the book, which is called Bon Voyage. Bright sunshine streamed down on us as we crossed the gangplank onto the majestic vessel that would carry us from New York City to Paris, France. This voyage, I believed, would make all my dreams come true. I'm obviously talking in her voice. That sojourn would enable me, a woman, to be a journalist, albeit for food and fashion, but in the most beautiful city in the world. My son Bobby was in tow, and he had to have our Springer Spaniel Mitzi with us. I had so many wonderful memories of Paris of the 1920s, and I wanted to now share all of Paris with Bobby. I would take my son to museums and sidewalk cafes and be invited to dinner parties. I made a list of the best sites in Paris that I had been to before and was prepared to show my son the Bois de Boulogne, the grand boulevards, the Louvre, the gardens, and palace at Versailles. As we transversed the ocean, I told him stories of my Paris. I told him how nothing compared to the Palace of Versailles and its gardens. The bedroom of Louis XV had beautiful medallions of his 4 daughters. The room next to it had paintings by Boucher, who created sumptuous, alluring women. The exuberance of the palace contrasted with the well-planned grounds that were laid out so perfectly that they seemed to be painted rather than planted. They reached out in every direction like the spokes of a wheel, stretching out as if they were avenues under the trees. They were trimmed like Gothic cathedral windows. I explained that we would spend most of our afternoons wandering down a path or cutting through the large trees sitting in the shade. But for me, the prettiest place of all seemed to be where everything grew naturally, where the hamlet is located. The hamlet was the retreat of Marie Antoinette's ladies when they tired of the pressures of court. They would dress as a peasant and go to live in a quaint little thatched cottage. It reminded me of a Corot painting. I wanted to one day be in that Corot painting, living in a little cottage by a lake. But first I would write exciting food articles and become known for my unique writings. In Paris, I could really add art and poetry to a food article, writing stories that became a part of people's lives. My enthusiasm and excitement was overwhelming until the next day on the cruise ship, when we arose to find low, dark clouds looming above, waves fiercely lapping against the bow. Perhaps I should have realized then to turn around. But I had a job as a journalist in Paris. How bad could it be? What could go wrong? I became constantly seasick, nauseous, and dizzy. But Bobby so enjoyed the open ship, and everything would be fine. I labored in our cabin as Bobby and Mitzi strolled the decks. Mitzi quickly became the star of the ship. She strutted down the promenade, her fluffy white and brown tail wagging as she was routinely pet by absolutely everyone on board. She would walk slowly by the dining room, and people would bring her scraps. If the band started to play music, she sat and attentively listened. Even the captain would stop to pet her as she wagged her tail with vim and vigor. At night, she had to go back to the kennel, where there was one other resident, a cat that howled incessantly the whole trip. She hated those loud noises and that cat, but how Mitzi loved the daytime of a trip. She would always hate loud, shrill noises. I miss her. After 11 days, we descended down the ramp of the boat in France. We strolled leisurely and excitedly off the ship. I had decided that it would be nice to take a little walk in the garden of a nearby chateau. I had decided that after I had been seasick for so many days of the journey, but now I was on land, and not just any land. I was in France. I was still feeling a bit nauseated from the seasickness and not paying much attention until suddenly I looked around more carefully and realized that there was something just not right with my Paris. There seemed to be a lot of commotion. We walked the street to the garden, but it soon became very clear that there was a pervasive tension in the air. Cars and trucks hurried by in every direction, not the casual stroll that I was used to in Paris. The city was in a feverish, depressed, and agitated mood. Oh, yes, it was October 1939, and France had just declared war on Germany. Was I so oblivious to the facts that England and France would declare war on Germany after Germany had invaded Poland? I heard someone say, "It is rumored that the Germans are actually not far from Rouen." There was a crowd in the square in front of Jeanne d'Arc's statue. "But they can't be coming this way," a man named Bill protested. "Oh, yes," leered a large, ugly man in the crowd. "They will surround Paris, you know. It is a fever of madness," cried another. There was deafening loud shouting, and people were worrying about bridges being destroyed up and down the Seine or Notre Dame Cathedral being bombed. There seemed to be a roar of smoke and military in the distance. The first man, Bill, now stood there quietly, afraid, a desolate wreck. He sat down on a bench and just sobbed. We looked around in disbelief and hurried to get a taxi to our apartment that the United Press International, UPI, had rented for us. It was on the 5th floor in the Paris suburb of Moudon. I told Bobby that we will figure it all out once we were settled. After all, I had my dream job. Writing about food and fashion in Paris, the center of it all, I decided that even war couldn't take that away from me. So I thought. At the beginning of the war, I would talk to French women every day at the post office as they sent out packages of food and knit things for the menfolk who were far from home. I read that they said in every French newspaper and magazine. One article written by a newspaper columnist praised the women who were organizing the relief efforts. My own first column for UPI declared to the women of France, "You are as brave as the finest Red Cross nurse in the whole land. You are working without honor or glory. Before you enjoyed feasts and evenings together, enjoy something today with your friends, even if it is only a cup of tea with milk in the afternoon while the children are gathering for cocoa." I thought that what the families and soldiers needed was a boost to their morale. Women complained about how the menfolks were broken. They all needed their spirits lifted. UPI agreed that I must do that. I wrote hundreds of joyous articles about cooking and recipes and entertaining those very first months. After that was what a woman was expected to write. I wrote that families should take out their little garden chairs and tables, even if it was cold outside. That didn't last long. Who sits in the garden as bombs fall or Germans march outside your building? I was so naive. I told them to send out little invitations to different people each day. Make the envelope by simply folding some khaki-colored paper 3 ways. Finish the envelope with a seal, be it a red cross or red circular motif, star seal, anything that is good with a pale cream colored khaki paper. Slip the paper invitation inside. Each should be carefully written in your finest penmanship. That was my job. Transform the blue light into a golden yellow glow of joy. Yellow and blue make green, and that was better than the dark mood that engulfed the city and the people. But life soon changed dramatically. The next months were anything but a sojourn of museums and parties. Life was filled with fear and anticipation of the unknown. Young men, fathers, brothers, sons were gone off to fight. I lay in bed listening to the bombs falling around us and big guns going full blast back at them. It was all happening just a few miles away on the outskirts of Versailles and the 2 towns next to us. Our large apartment building shook, and Mitzi came up to me in the apartment shivering in the dark, the whites of her big brown eyes staring out. She jumped onto the bed and slithered between my feet. Next, Bobby came running in. "Mommy, Mommy, I am afraid. What is the noise? I am so afraid." "Bobby, we don't have to go outside. Those are not sirens for us to go to shelters. We are staying in our beds right now with the blackout curtains pulled tight." He was soon fast asleep. My soothing words comforted him. He believed that I knew how to protect him. I wished I believed it. I stayed up all night long with Mitzi at my feet and Bobby curled up and snuggling next to me. Yes, I was in Paris, a mother without a husband during war. The eerie silence on the side streets was striking. Every child that could be sent to the countryside had gone. Some were in private homes, some with their grandparents. Mothers and older women often left with the children to do whatever they could. City women in Burgundy helped with grape harvest. More than half the population of Paris had left. The town had a dark and dreary feeling. Many houses were completely shuttered already. Shopkeepers covered their windows with crisscross strips of gummed reinforced paper to prevent them from being broken and prevent anyone from looking into the windows. Add to this the blue paint covering on many of the windows and doors, so that at night a light could be used inside and would not shine outward in case of bombings. Street lamps were also covered with a dense blue paint, and there was scarcely any light if you strolled the streets at night. It was a profound silence that soaked into the very fabric of your being. It was always dark, except for the eerie blue glow. The blue glow permeated your whole being as you tried to keep the fear out from spilling out. It's funny, I think back about one day late in November at about 4 or 5 o'clock, I decided I really needed a new hat. The things that you worry about when you refuse to face what is happening. I wanted some semblance of normalcy. I went weaving my way through the greenish blue streets of dimly lit images. I couldn't locate any of the shops that I knew. I couldn't look in shop windows. I couldn't find a hat. A hat, I worried about a hat. And now I would give up all my worldly possessions to stop the noise. All we could hear was the whistling, whirling sounds, crashing explosions, sirens screeching, warning us. But where do we run to? Then the silence was interrupted by children screaming, women's muffled weeping. The gripping fear of another bombardment in your belly was never far away. No place to go, no way to escape from these sounds except to hopelessly cover your ears. It was worse than 100 cats screeching in the night. Every minute was the anticipation of another plummeting bomb. An aviator tossed 5 or 6 bombs out of his plane right near our building, demolishing, flattening homes and killing men, women, children indiscriminately. Lives that were meant to be lived. Young men, women, and children. Lives that had struggled with intimate and happy moments at another time while working in offices or farms. They brought home presents and treats when they could have before. These were lives not yet fully lived. These were the people that in the flash of a moment had been killed by the bombs. After days of continuous bombings, it suddenly stopped. It was June 14th, 1940, and now Bitsy was barking incessantly, and 8-year-old Bobby ran into my room. I tried to quiet them both, their barking, chattering. I couldn't hear what was going on. "People will hear you," I yelled. "Stop." Then I remembered that the huge building that we're in was basically empty, deserted, and no one would hear any of us. 5 families of the 22 that had lived in our building originally had deserted, and no one would hear any of us. 5 families of the 22. They were lucky if they had their own car. There were no taxis, trains, or cars available in Paris. And where would you go? The Germans were approaching. Would they let them leave? Should we have left? Could we? We were Americans, and America was helping the French and British. We couldn't risk getting caught. It was 6 a.m. when Bobby had begun shouting and Mitzi barking, their sounds echoing into the darkened halls, kitchens, and abandoned bedrooms where only the remnants of people's lives lived and remained. Clothes were left strewn in the empty apartments. Kitchen cabinets had been left open and emptied. Broken china lay on the floors. Mitzi ran to the windows, so I finally drew the courage to look out the window of our apartment. Our building was surrounded by German troops. I grabbed my press pass and put the cord around my neck in case they came in. I was a journalist. They wouldn't harm me and my family, right? I thought that my press pass would be my warrior's shield. I clutched it tightly in my hand. I quieted Mitzi and told Bobby to stay away from the window. I didn't know what to do next. I was shaking with fear. What do you do when the bombs are falling and the German troops are parading past your window? When you have a child, displays of fear and showering of tears are just not an option. I had to do something. So I did what every mother and housewife of the 1930s was expected to do. I scrubbed the floors, the cabinets, and cleaned every inch of the apartment. I sang happy tunes as I cleaned to drown out the sounds of the marching troops below, the sound of rolling vehicles, horses, the pounding of footsteps in unison. My singing got louder, although sometimes it was broken as I held back tears. For hours it went on and on, rolling troops, cleaning, singing, scrubbing, as if I could wash it all away. I stopped and looked at the few cans of food we had left in the cupboard. 3 stacks of cans, 10 or 12 evaporated milk, peaches, pears, and a few green peas, a couple of cans of pork and beans. For breakfast, we ate plain piece of bread, sometimes with a cup of hot water with a beef bouillon cube that had rustled up a few weeks before. 1 cube would go for 4 cups of hot water. Once in a great while, I found a shredded wheat biscuit for Bobby to eat with plain water. Maybe we had enough for 2 weeks, 3 if I stretch it out. What would we do then? The stores were all closed. It had taken me more than a month to accumulate this amount. There was a limit to what I could carry home and up those flights of steps, since the elevator was no longer running. I came to Paris because of what I thought was the opportunity of a lifetime. I was hired by UPI to write about French food and fashion. Now my life was reduced to a few cans and a German cookie. I had 1 cookie left, well, maybe 2. They were sugar cookies remaining in jar. They were yellow stars with pointed edges and a sprinkling of nuts and cinnamon just over the center. I think they are called Nuremberg cookies. How ironic to have only German-named cookies left. Distressed from looking at our remaining cans and 2 cookies, I ran to the other window on the other side of the apartment. From this window, I could see Paris spread out before me, dappled in early morning sun. The city, thought to be by many the most beautiful in the world, still stood, thank goodness. Perhaps I had calmed Bobby's fears too much, as now he didn't seem to quite understand the danger of the German troops marching before me. He suddenly saw it as a great big parade, as a young boy would. He didn't want to stay still or be quiet any longer or stay in the apartment, and declared that his friend's mother was across the street and that she was sick. I must go find my friend Renee. Are you mad? I said. Don't you understand that those are Hitler's men down there? You are staying right here in the kitchen. The kitchen had always been our special safe place, and now he was running from it. He pulled his pants on over his pajamas and yelled, "But I can't. Renee has no food. His mama might be dying. Don't you care?" I just replied, exasperated. "What? Wait, please. No, don't go. No, you must stay here." Bobby had been coming into the house with all kinds of stories for the last couple of weeks, but I guessed that I hadn't listened very well. He had told me that everyone was leaving town or getting ready to leave to go to the country, to farms anywhere away from here, to a place with food. He said to me, "They won't stay and wait for the Germans to come and kill them." He kept telling me that everyone was leaving and we must leave. He was right, I knew. We should have left. But how could we leave? We had both seen the procession of people leaving Paris suburb every day. "Please, Mommy, Renee's father is a soldier and they haven't heard from him in over 3 weeks. She doesn't have any money. They don't even have any jam." Jam. I didn't know what any of this had to do with jam. And his mom has been sick in bed for a week. I held on to his capuchin, that long cape with a hood that French schoolboys wore to protect them from the rain. He pulled and pulled towards the door. Again, I tried to be rational, explain that the Germans hate English people. They hate Americans even more because we are helping the English and French. I said, "You will get caught and start speaking English. You will land us both in prison or worse. I simply cannot let you go. You must not go out." I grabbed him, but he broke away. He was so strong and disobedient. He ran into the hallway and defiantly said, "No, Mom, I will speak French, not English. I won't talk to them at all, just to Renee. You taught me French since I was very little. I will speak only French. Bobby, Bobby, please come back." I yelled, "No, please, no." Bobby was gone with Mitzi running after him. I yelled after him, "Please stop. I won't let them starve, but please not now." He was off down the stairs, and they were gone. I ran to the window to see if I could spot them leaving the building. There was a sea of khaki and gray, covered wagons, and men unhitching their horses. So that's how the book begins, and you'll have to come back for part 2 to see what happens to Sue Moody and Bobby and Mitzi. But I wanted to take the last few minutes to share some of the materials that are here as well. So when we got these, there were papers just like this. And we finally found a picture of Sue Moody over here. You can see what she looked like. This was her college. She was actually from Kansas, and this was her college picture from Kansas. And I have another picture of here. She was actually part of the ROTC, and that was her picture for ROTC. She wrote one of her famous books that came out. She did this book, 150 Ways to Serve Ice Cream. I know we were thinking you just scoop it out from the gallon container, but there's a lot of other things you could do with it. And she wrote articles, as you see here. This one's for International Herald, for all different newspapers and magazines, Ladies' Home Journal. And they would always be recipes with things about the country, which is what got her the job in Paris, because she would write about different countries that she had been to and how the recipes fit with it. This book over here was her grandfather, who was a very famous politician, but also writer. He also wrote poetry, and he was a big influence of hers. And she would also find that he was a suffragette as she did research. And he's the one that inspired her to keep a journal and keep diaries of it. So his background and her own Quaker background is what led her to believe that she could actually go to France and survive during the war. And she would constantly pull against all of these things in order to survive, and how she survived in Paris. Found in the journals, just to give you a little bit of a hint of what else there is to come, found in the journals and letters were stories of these formidable years that strengthened her and made her able to continue. She had married Johnny, and this is a book that he wrote as well. So I have books that he wrote. And she thought that together they would be the perfect team, because he was also a writer and a journalist, and he would allow her to continue to do her writing. And they traveled to Paris, and she went to many different places with him until he became difficult and became one of the dragons that she had slayed. So the title, Slaying the Dragons, is about all the different difficulties, whether it was her husband, being a wife, mother, and a professional, and the depression, the war, all of these things, her illness, which will come through in the book as she tries to slay each of the dragon, and ultimately winds up in Otis, Mass.